I read the original Mistborn trilogy quite a while back, and for a while I never really had the urge or desire to look into Mistborn Era 2. That was until recently when I finished another book by Brandon Sanderson. I finally realized that I need to actually get caught up on my Cosmere reading. So I read the first book of Mistborn Era 2 and decided to do a review on it, and I can say I'm pleasantly surprised. Character. In Mistborn Era 2, our team of protagonists change, of course, as this takes place hundreds of years later. This time we're following famous lawman Wax and his plucky sidekick Wayne. Now I will say that the first book in this area is quite shorter than I anticipated. I'm so used to massive tomes with Brandon Sanderson that I was actually quite surprised when I saw it was just a normal sized book. This isn't a massive problem though. While the shorter nature of the book means we didn't get to know the main characters very well yet, I wasn't bothered. I know that in a series or trilogy the first book is often just the introduction to the cast with some progression thrown in. In this book, however, it seems like it was more of a focused introduction. Instead of part of the book being focused on progression, this felt more like a book setting up further events in the story, with the focus being more on introduction and setup. We got to meet the characters and get a real feel for them before starting the rest of the books. Definitely not the way most authors would do it, but this is Brandon Sanderson, so it's understandable and definitely forgivable. So while we didn't get to see the characters progress too much, we did get to interact with them and become familiar with them. I love Wayne's witty remarks, and Wax's intelligent intensity is awesome on the page. But not seeing the characters progress does hold it back a little. So with that said, I'd give the characters a 7 out of 10. A respectable score that would have been much higher had Brandon taken more time for this book. I only hope the coming books in the series show the characters being more dynamic, but even so, Brandon manages to still write the characters well enough for a score like this. Plot. Like I said in my previous point, this book is quite short, so instead of the slow burn I've come to get used to with Sanderson's works, we're now in a story that progresses quite quickly. The actual plot is quite interesting and definitely feels very much like the setup for something much bigger down the road. I didn't much care for the main villain in this book though. It's an interesting concept, and having the powers and past he has was fun to read about, but that's about it. We didn't really have a chance to get to know the antagonist, so we didn't very much care about him or the final fight. That said, I did still enjoy the whole Sherlock Holmes feel of the book, and I enjoyed the overall structure of the plot despite some issues I have. Overall, I'd give the plot a 6 out of 10. Above average for sure, but knowing what Brandon Sanderson can normally pull off, I can't in good faith give this plot a score any higher than that. World building. So what's interesting about Mistborn Era 2 is that with the context of having previously read Era 1, the world building becomes a lot more concrete. You've actually read this world before, so now the history of the world is actually quite expansive lore. Now granted, for anyone who hasn't read Era 1, this point is no longer valid, but if anyone does start with Era 2, I think it would be the exception, and most people would likely follow the proper reading order. And in addition to having read the previous books, which gives a lot of context to the world's history and setting, Sanderson does a masterful job of setting the scene in this new time period. We caught up pretty well on the events that unfolded in the space between the two eras, and while I'm sure we'll learn a lot more, the whole world and setting feels a lot more concrete this time around. There's a diversity of religions with strong historical ties, each with its own core tenets and belief. The language and culture also feels like it has more properly progressed since the first era. Technology has reached the industrial age, and the whole Victorian England vibe we now get plays really well with the story. All in all, I'd give the world building in Mistborn Alloy of Law a well-deserved 9 out of 10. It felt a lot more grounded than Era 1 for me, and I feel like I'm going to enjoy this setting a lot more going forward. Scadrial is a unique world that Brandon has spent a lot of good hours on fine-tuning. I doubt you'd find many fantasy authors who can craft a world to the caliber and quality that Sanderson can. Magic. The magic in Era 2 is of course just a continuation of the magic in Era 1. What I liked, however, is the fact that instead of just sticking to the same concepts we've explored before, Sanderson actually gave us a proper progression. The magic has naturally progressed and changed since we last saw it. New limits on both Allomancy and Ferrochemy, along with having the main cast be only Mistings and not all powerful Mistborn, really did a lot to elevate the stakes for me. Don't get me wrong, Vin was an awesome character and an allomantic badass that will always be up there with the greats when it comes to fantasy protagonists, but I enjoy it a lot more when a character is more limited. It's more important to have the character be limited in terms of their power, yet having them accomplish their goals despite those limitations. It's how good character progression intertwines with good magic system management. And in Alloy of Law, the powers certainly do feel a lot more limited. There's no fight that our characters can just breeze through because they happen to be a Mistborn. So in this sense, I feel the magic system for Alloy of Law to be far better integrated and utilized within the narrative than previous Mistborn entries. So I would gladly give the magic system a 9 out of 10. I basically never give a 10 out of 10 for anything, but I was really close to doing so this time. The only reason it isn't higher is because I had to consider how much it was relying on the previous era to make this impression on me. It was still fantastically done in its own merit, but I had to consider the possibility of my judgment being skewed by Era 1. Structure. And finally we have the structure of the novel. How well is it paced? Was the prose any good? How well did all the elements come together? All these need to be considered. Well, on the pacing side, I actually found this book to be faster paced than previous books I'd read by Sanderson. There's no slow, plodding sections and it wastes no time in going from point A to point B. Now this would have been fine, but I do think it went a bit too quickly for my tastes. Had Brandon maybe taken an extra 100 or so pages, it would have felt less rushed in certain sections. As for the prose, it's no secret that I'm not really a fan of Sanderson's prose style. I feel it's too bland, undescriptive and sparse for me to enjoy it. I enjoy beautiful prose with passages that take your breath away. I enjoy prose like, for example, Robert Jordan's or Scott Lynch. It doesn't have to be over the top, but it does have to be of a certain level of descriptiveness and poetic quality for me to enjoy it. Unfortunately, Sanderson continues to pioneer the modern fantasy trend to write with very transparent and straightforward prose. Not really a problem for most readers, but it's something I care about. And finally, as for the composition of all the elements and how it all came together, I feel Brandon does this extremely well, as he does for all other stories. Brandon Sanderson is known for his well-structured and satisfying books. He's the king of structure, so naturally he brings together all the elements within the story in a masterful manner. Overall, I'd give the structure a 7 out of 10. It's held back by the prose and slightly faster pace than I prefer, but ultimately it's still a very well done book in that aspect. Anyone who reads Sanderson would likely agree that despite his flaws, he still pulls off every book he does with masterful skill. The Alloy of Law was a very fun first foray into the second Mistborn era. I'm glad that this book feels very much like an introduction to the characters. I can only see myself growing more attached to these characters as time goes on. And the world building and magic are both masterfully handled. Take that along with a decent plot and you have the makings of a very good novel. Even with some of the issues I had with the structure, it all came together very well. So overall, I'd like to give Alloy of Law, the first book in the second Mistborn era, a final score of 7.6 out of 10. A very good score for the first book in the series, and I'm definitely excited to see more. But, as I always say, those were just my opinions. What did you think of Alloy of Law? Let me know in the comments below. Anyway guys, that has been it for today. I sincerely hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, I hope you'd consider subscribing. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.